Trigger warning. It was 10:23 p.m. on December 8th, and I had just stepped out of the shower. The steam from the hot water still clung to the mirror as I wiped it away, getting ready to collapse into bed. But, as always, there was one last thing to do: check my phone before calling it a night. I unlocked it and my screen lit up with a barrage of notifications. The group chat was usually quiet, just the occasional message here and there, but tonight, dozens of unread messages filled the screen. There were only 4 of us in the chat: Zeke, Morgan, Jack, and me. We were old college friends. Over the years, we'd stayed in touch, meeting up for drinks or the occasional weekend hangout. But it had been a while since we'd all been together. Curious, I scrolled up to see what had caused the sudden flurry of activity. The first message was from Zeke, of course. He'd sent a picture of a cabin, wooden, rustic, and nestled in the middle of a snow-covered clearing. The warm glow of lights in the windows and the curl of smoke rising from the chimney made it look inviting, cozy even. Along with the picture, he wrote, "What do you guys think? $400 a night, split 4 ways, it's nothing. Should we plan a little getaway up north?" I stared at the image for a moment. The cabin did look nice, quaint, and honestly, it had been ages since I'd gotten away. Life had become routine. Work was a grind, and everything else felt like it was on repeat. The idea of a snowy escape with old friends sounded like the perfect break. Morgan was the first to reply. "OMG, yes. Jack and I are in." He said it really was. He just couldn't get the film ready to move for printing. Jack, predictably, didn't have much to say. His reply came a few minutes later, likely after Morgan had convinced him, "Yeah, sounds good." Zeke, always one to tease, followed up with, "That's the spirit, Jack. Way to take charge." I smiled at that. Poor Jack. Then Zeke sent another message, this one directed at me. "Grace?" I lost my thumb hovering over the screen. I glanced back at the picture of the cabin. It looked so peaceful, so inviting. I hadn't been on a trip in forever. Maybe this was just what I needed. After a moment's hesitation, I typed back, "Sure, I'm in." Zeke's reply came almost immediately. "Hell yeah, it's happening." Morgan followed up with, "This is going to be so fun. We'll figure out the dates tomorrow." Loaded question. I smiled to myself as I set my phone down on the nightstand and climbed into bed. The thought of the cabin stayed with me as I drifted off to sleep, the promise of a getaway with old friends lingering in my mind. Footnote: the next night, December 9th, my phone buzzed relentlessly, delivering half a dozen messages in the span of 30 seconds. I picked it up, already guessing who was responsible for the sudden barrage. Zeke had sent the first message. "Booked it, Deck 30th to Jan 8th. We're officially cabin-bound people." Attached was an image of the booking confirmation. Morgan was, predictably, the first to respond. Her reply was a whirlwind of enthusiasm, expressed through an absurd combination of 7 emojis: a snowflake, a fire, a pine tree, a heart, a smiley face, a champagne bottle, and a party popper. I couldn't help but laugh and type back, calling off work in advance, looking forward to it. Zeke gave a thumbs up, and Jack, as usual, stayed quiet. December 29th, 8:16 p.m. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Zeke. "Hey, do you need a ride? I can pick you up tomorrow before we leave. It's just about a 20-minute drive." I'd been waiting for this text. My car had given up on me a few days earlier and was still in the shop, leaving me stranded. I quickly replied, "Yes, please. Thanks, man. I'll be ready." Zeke responded with a simple, "Cool. See you tomorrow." With that settled, I started getting my bags ready. Clothes, toiletries, a couple of books I probably wouldn't read but brought anyway, and some snacks for the road. Everything was packed and set by the door. All that was left was one more day of work. December 30th. By the time I got home from work, I was exhausted, but the excitement of the trip kept me moving. I double-checked my bags, grabbed my coat, and texted Zeke, "I'm ready whenever you are." Initiated the adventure. 15 minutes later, the rumble of Zeke's truck pulling into my driveway signaled his arrival. I stepped outside, shivering slightly in the cold, and waved as he rolled down the window. "Hey, Grace," he called out with a grin. "Ready for some cabin vibes?" "Definitely," I said, tossing my bags into the bed of his truck. I climbed into the passenger seat and we were off. The hum of the engine and the rhythmic thud of tires on asphalt quickly lulled me into a comfortable haze. I didn't even realize how tired I was until my eyelids started to droop. The last thing I remembered before falling asleep was Zeke humming along to some old rock song on the radio, the snow-covered landscape outside the window fading into a blur. When I woke up, Zeke's hand was on my shoulder, gently shaking me awake. I blinked, disoriented, and noticed the truck was parked in front of a small diner. "Hey," Zeke said, his voice cutting through my grogginess. "Morgan and Jack should be here in about 10 minutes. They wanted to meet up before we head up to the cabin." I nodded, shaking off the remnants of sleep, and climbed out of the truck. The cold air hit me like a slap to the face, making me instantly more alert. We walked into the diner together, Zeke leading the way as I trudged behind, still trying to gather my composure. Inside, the warm air and smell of frying bacon greeted us. A waitress guided us to a booth in the corner. I slid into my seat, ordered a small meal, just enough to tide me over, and leaned back, trying to shake off the chill. Zek raised an eyebrow. "Is that all you're ordering?" "Yeah, I'm not starving," I replied. "Come on, Grace, none of us are great cooks. Might as well enjoy a decent meal now." I rolled my eyes, but added a side of pancakes to my order. 5 minutes later, Morgan and Jack arrived, spotting us easily in the corner. Morgan slid into the booth beside me without hesitation, leaving Jack and Zeke to squeeze into the other side. Jack looked mildly annoyed, but Zeke just grinned, adjusting to the cramped space. After finishing our meals, we headed back outside. The cold was sharper now, and the snow crunched beneath our boots as we climbed into our vehicles. Zek's truck led the way up the mountain, the road winding through thick forests dusted in white. About 10 minutes later, we arrived. For $400 a night, the cabin was a steal. The rustic exterior was charming, with wide wooden beams and a wraparound porch that overlooked the snowy landscape. Smoke from the chimney hinted at a fireplace, and the soft glow of the porch light made it feel inviting, despite the frigid air. I grabbed my bags from the back of Zeke's truck and headed toward the door. A small lockbox hung beside it, containing the key. "Zeke, what's the code for the key?" I yelled over my shoulder. 6,278, he shouted back from where he was unloading bags. My fingers were half frozen by the time I punched in the code and retrieved the key. The relief of stepping inside and feeling the warm air wash over me was almost euphoric. The first thing I did was turn on the heat to make sure the cabin stayed warm. Before long, everyone had shuffled inside, their arms full of bags and supplies. I ran upstairs, eager to claim a room, and chose the one farthest down the hall. It was cozy, with a window overlooking the snowy forest, and just enough space for a bed and a small dresser. Leaning over the banister that overlooked the living room, I called down to Zeke, who was still near the door. "Come on and get unpacked already." Zeke hesitantly did so and fell through the door to the top. He waved me off with a laugh, and I returned to my room to unpack my things. Once everyone had settled in, we gathered in the living room and broke out a game of Monopoly. It was fun, something I needed to help wind down. By the time we finished, it was late, and everyone was ready to crash. One by one, we retreated to our rooms, the cabin growing quiet as we drifted off to sleep. Here's a cleaned-up version of Part 4, keeping it concise and smooth. Night 2, December 31st. The cabin had been everything I needed. Fun, relaxing, and a perfect escape from the grind of everyday life. But as it turned out, this was the last night things would feel normal. I had just finished dinner and was waiting for my turn to take a shower. Everyone had been arguing earlier about who should go first, so I volunteered to go last. It wasn't a big deal. I preferred a quiet shower anyway. "Grace, I'm out of the shower," Morgan's voice called from upstairs. He grabbed my towel and headed up, stepping into the bathroom. The air was thick and humid, the mirror fogged from the heat of everyone else's showers. I shut the door behind me, stripped off my clothes, and stepped into the warm water. The shower was everything I needed. I stayed in longer than I probably should have, letting the water soothe my muscles and steam away the stress of the day. By the time my fingers had pruned, I finally forced myself to get out, grabbing a towel to dry off. It wasn't until I was ready to head back to my room that I noticed something odd. My dirty clothes were gone. I'd taken off my tall, expressionless Polish rough suit and turned into a ragloin of Wimper's sister. At first I thought maybe I'd misplaced them, but as I looked around, a flicker of unease crept into my mind. My thoughts jumped to all sorts of irrational conclusions. Then I thought of the recalled patients I'd seen the week ago. I stepped out into the hallway, still clutching my towel, and nearly ran into Zeke. He was standing there with a small laundry basket in his hands. "You scared the shit out of me," I blurted, startled. "I thought someone stole my clothes." Zeke chuckled, though it sounded a little forced. "No, just keeping up on laundry." I stared at him, my heart still racing. "Maybe you could have waited until I was finished. Asshole." His expression shifted. The easygoing demeanor he usually wore disappeared, replaced by something colder, more serious. "I was waiting," he said flatly, "but someone decided to take an hour in the shower. I want to go to bed, and I promised I'd do the laundry." I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. His tone was sharp, and I felt a little embarrassed for snapping at him. "Fine," I muttered, brushing past him and heading to my room. Once inside, I closed the door and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I checked the time. 11:15 p.m. Maybe I was a little hard on him, I thought, trying to shake off the lingering discomfort. I turned off the light and climbed into bed, ready to let the day end. Here's a cleaned-up version of Part 5, keeping the tension and flow intact. Night 3, January 1st. The day had started like any other. After breakfast, we bundled up in layers and decided to take on the ambitious challenge of building the biggest snowman we could. It was harder than it looked, but the effort was half the fun. Between snowball fights, laughter, and Morgan insisting on giving the snowman a fashionable scarf, the day flew by. By the time we got back inside, I was exhausted but looking forward to a hot shower. As usual, I took the last turn, leaving my clothes just outside the bathroom door before stepping into the steamy sanctuary. The water was soothing, washing away the chill of the day, and as always, I let my mind wander. I stayed in longer than I probably should have, lost in thought. But then something pulled me back to reality. I glanced up, and my heart stopped. In the ceiling above the shower was a small hole, no bigger than a quarter. At first, I thought maybe it was just a random imperfection in the wood, but then I saw it. An eye. Someone was watching me. A scream tore from my throat as I bolted out of the bathroom, barely managing to wrap a towel around myself. In my panic, I tripped over the pile of clothes I'd left outside the door, hitting the floor hard. Before I could gather myself, the others came running. Morgan and Jack rushed up the stairs, their faces etched with concern. Zeke appeared from his room, his expression unreadable. "Well, what happened?" Morgan asked, kneeling to help me up. Oh, I stuttered, still trying to catch my breath. "Morn," she said gently, guiding me toward my room. "We can talk about this later." Once inside, Morgan stayed with me while I dried off and got dressed. I could barely form a coherent thought, let alone speak, but eventually I managed to get the words out. Maybe I was a little hard on him, I thought, trying to shake off the lingering discomfort. I turned off the light and climbed into bed, ready to let the day end. Here's a cleaned-up version of Part 5, keeping the tension and flow intact. Night 3, January 1st. The day had started like any other. After breakfast, we bundled up in layers and decided to take on the ambitious challenge of building the biggest snowman we could. It was harder than it looked, but the effort was half the fun. Between snowball fights, laughter, and Morgan insisting on giving the snowman a fashionable scarf, the day flew by. By the time we got back inside, I was exhausted but looking forward to a hot shower. As usual, I took the last turn, leaving my clothes just outside the bathroom door before stepping into the steamy sanctuary. The water was soothing, washing away the chill of the day, and as always, I let my mind wander. I stayed in longer than I probably should have, lost in thought. But then something pulled me back to reality. I glanced up, and my heart stopped. In the ceiling above the shower was a small hole, no bigger than a quarter. At first, I thought maybe it was just a random imperfection in the wood, but then I saw it. An eye. Someone was watching me. A scream tore from my throat as I bolted out of the bathroom, barely managing to wrap a towel around myself. In my panic, I tripped over the pile of clothes I'd left outside the door, hitting the floor hard. Before I could gather myself, the others came running. Morgan and Jack rushed up the stairs, their faces etched with concern. Zeke appeared from his room, his expression unreadable. "What happened?" Morgan asked, kneeling to help me up. I stuttered, still trying to catch my breath. "Me this morning," she said gently, guiding me toward my room. "We can talk about this later." Once inside, Morgan stayed with me while I dried off and got dressed. I could barely form a coherent thought, let alone speak, but eventually I managed to get the words out. "Well, there was a hole in the ceiling of the shower," I stammered, my voice trembling. "I swear I saw an eye looking at me." Morgan's face darkened, but she kept her voice calm. "I believe you," she said, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "We'll get to the bottom of this." I wanted to leave. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out of that cabin, but I didn't have a ride home. I was stuck. Later, we all gathered in the living room. Morgan explained what had happened, her tone serious as she recounted my story. I stayed silent, my hands clenched into fists as I stared at the floor. Morgan had taken a picture of the hole in the shower, and when she showed it to us, we saw that it was now covered by something. The sight sent a fresh wave of unease through me. For a long time, no one said anything. The room was heavy with tension, the crackling fire the only sound. But slowly, doubt began to creep into the conversation. "As you ran out of there pretty quick," Zeke said, his voice calm but firm. "Are you sure you didn't just imagine it?" Jack nodded, though he looked uncomfortable. "Yeah, I mean, it was just a quick peek, right? It could have been anything." Morgan shot them both a glare but didn't argue. I could see the doubt creeping into her expression too. I wanted to fight back, to insist that I wasn't imagining things, but I didn't. Maybe I was just too tired. Maybe I didn't want to believe what I'd seen either. The room eventually fell quiet, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even as I forced myself to smile and nod along. Night 4, January 2nd. The day dragged on in a haze of unease. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and every creak of the cabin made my skin crawl. We'd all agreed no one would step foot in the upstairs bathroom again, opting for the cramped and less appealing downstairs one. It wasn't ideal, but it felt safer somehow. I spent most of the day curled up in the living room, trying to distract myself with games or small talk, but my mind kept circling back to the night before. The others tried to lighten the mood, but I could see the tension in their faces too. By nightfall, I had loosened up a bit. The fire was warm, and the company helped dull the edge of my fear. But as bedtime approached, the anxiety crept back in. When I got to my room, I turned on every light and started searching. I wasn't going to let myself sleep without making sure there were no more surprises. It didn't take long. Right above my bed there was another hole, about the size of a quarter. It had been covered up, but not well enough to hide the faint outline. My heart pounded in my chest as I bolted out of the room. I ran down the hall and started knocking frantically on Morgan's door. She opened it, looking startled. "What's wrong?" "Another hole," I said breathlessly, "above my bed." Morgan didn't hesitate. She grabbed her phone and followed me back to my room. Soon, all four of us were crowded in there, staring up at the ceiling. Zeke held a flashlight, illuminating the faintly covered hole. "The listing never mentioned an attic," Zeke said, his voice calm but thoughtful. "But it did say there's a basement." "Basement?" Morgan asked, frowning. Zeke nodded. "I looked last night. I couldn't find an entrance. It must be hidden somewhere." His words didn't comfort me. If anything, they made my skin crawl. I opened my mouth ready to say I wanted to leave, but Morgan cut me off. "Grace, you can sleep with me tonight," she said, her voice firm but kind. I nodded, relieved for the moment, but unable to shake the feeling that this wasn't over. As we all filed out of the room, I glanced back at the hole one last time. It felt like it was staring back at me. Got it. Here's a cleaner, slightly expanded version of the first part of Part 7 to help build tension and make the scene feel more natural. Night 6, January 4th. The day had been eerily quiet. After everything that had happened, the absence of tension felt almost unnatural. Jack and Morgan had gone out to grab supplies for the final 2 days, leaving me alone with Zeke. I sat on the couch, trying to distract myself with the TV, but it felt like my mind was working overtime. The unease gnawed at me, never quite letting go. Zeke was in the kitchen, busy making coffee. The quiet buzz of his phone on the coffee table caught my attention. Without thinking, I reached over to check the time, but my thumb accidentally swiped left. The camera app opened. That's when I saw it. In the corner of the screen, the preview of the last picture taken, my picture, was displayed. I froze. It was a shot of me, lying in bed. The angle, the lighting, the unmistakable perspective, it had been taken through the hole above my bed. A cold wave of dread washed over me. My stomach dropped, and my heart pounded so loudly I thought Zeke might hear it. My body went stiff, but I forced myself to stay calm, carefully placing the phone back on the table. I couldn't let him know I'd seen it, not yet. The SS guys responded, and the intake group left the flattery. I grabbed my own phone, my fingers shaking as I quickly created a group chat with Jack and Morgan. My mind raced as I typed a single message. SOS, it's Zeke. I set my phone to silent, praying they'd see it in time. Coffee's ready, Zeke called from the kitchen, his voice casual, too calm. I turned around, forcing a smile as he approached with 2 steaming mugs. Thanks, I said, taking the cup from him. I wanted to scream, to run, but I knew that would only make things worse. The best plan was to play along. I took a sip, pretending to relax, but every fiber of my being was on high alert. Oh, I think I left my phone in Morgan's room. Be right back. I stood up, my legs feeling like jelly beneath me. I moved quickly but quietly, heading upstairs. Once I was out of sight, I peeked over the banister. Zeke was back in the living room, his eyes glued to the TV, unaware of my movements. I slipped into his room. I needed to confirm it was him. I started with his bag, my hands trembling as I dug through it. My stomach churned when I found them. My panties from the second night, hidden deep inside, buried among his things. I snapped a picture with my phone, my fingers shaking as I fought back the rising nausea. The room felt like it was closing in on me, and I could barely breathe. Then my eyes landed on the closet. There, tucked away behind a stack of clothes, I noticed something. A small hatch, almost imperceptible unless you were looking for it. My heart skipped a beat. I reached for it, my hands slick with sweat, and pulled it open just a crack. A faint, musty smell hit me, but I didn't have time to investigate. The briefest glimpse inside revealed nothing more than shadows and an old, forgotten toolkit. But I didn't need to see more. I knew what it meant. This was where he had been watching me. Before I could process the implications, my head began to spin. My vision blurred and my limbs grew heavy. I staggered backward, my knees buckling beneath me, but just before I collapsed, I heard Zeke's voice from the doorway. "That coffee hit you, huh?" I turned to see him standing there, leaning against the doorframe, his expression a mixture of amusement and something darker. He didn't look surprised. He'd been waiting for this moment. "So, I guess you figured it out," he said, stepping closer, his voice low and calm. "Shame it's at the expense of your life." I tried to move, tried to run, but my body wouldn't respond. The darkness took over and everything went black. When I woke up, my head was throbbing and my mouth was dry. Panic surged through me as I realized I couldn't move. My wrists were tied tightly to the bed frame and a gag was shoved into my mouth, choking off any sound I tried to make. I struggled against the restraints, my mind racing with thoughts of what might have happened while I was unconscious. The fear of not knowing what he'd done to me was almost worse than the pain. Zeke was sitting nearby, casually zipping up his bag. The sight of him was almost surreal. He looked so calm, so detached, as though what was happening wasn't a big deal. He turned to me with a soft, almost affectionate smile, as if we were having some quiet, intimate conversation. "Grace," he said, his voice surprisingly tender. "I loved you. I really did. But you were too stupid to see that." I screamed against the gag, tears streaming down my face. My chest ached with the effort, and I thrashed against the ropes, my body desperate to break free. "I hate to do this to you," he continued, his voice low, almost regretful. "But I'm not going to get another chance." He climbed onto the bed, his weight pressing down on me. I froze, my body going stiff with terror. His hands brushed against my skin, and I wanted to scream, to fight, but I couldn't. The restraints were too tight, and my limbs felt like they were made of lead. "You remember that night we got drunk?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper, like we were sharing a secret. "You lifted your shirt for me. This isn't so different, is it?" I shook my head violently, my heart racing in my chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could feel was his presence closing in on me, suffocating me. "You're beautiful, you know that," he whispered, his hands moving to the hem of my shirt. "We won't be needing this." His fingers brushed against the fabric and I shuddered, my body reacting against him even though I couldn't move. I could feel his breath on my neck, his hands too close, and I knew what was coming. I couldn't stop it. Just as his hand reached under my shirt, I saw movement from the corner of my eye. Jack Morgan. Jack was holding the heavy prop gun from the fireplace mantel. He swung it with all his strength, hitting Zeke square in the back of the head. The impact was sickening, and Zeke collapsed onto the bed, unconscious before he even hit the mattress. Morgan was there in an instant, her hands shaking as she worked to untie me. She fumbled with the ropes, but within moments I was free. She ripped the gag from my mouth, and I gasped for air, my throat raw from the pressure. "We need to go," Jack said urgently, his voice tight with fear. I nodded, barely able to think, as they helped me out of the cabin and into their car. I could barely process what had just happened. My mind was still reeling from the terror, the helplessness. I kept seeing Zeke's face, his twisted smile, his hands on me. It was like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The drive to the authorities was a blur. Between sobs, I told them everything, about the hole, the pictures, the attic, the things Zeke had said. I showed them the evidence on my phone, desperate for them to believe me. But I knew, deep down, that it might be too late. By the time we reached the cabin, Zeke was gone. A manhunt is still underway, but deep down, I doubt they'll find him. Zeke is smart, too smart. He knows how to disappear. Now, days later, under the protection of the authorities, I still can't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak, every shadow, every fleeting sound sends a chill down my spine. Because I know he's still out there. January 16th. I thought I had seen the last of Zeke, but today, while I was cooking dinner, I heard the doorbell ring. When I opened the door, there was no one in sight. I scanned the yard, expecting to see a group of kids running off, but all I saw was a faint snow trail leading toward the road. At my feet, there was a post-it note. The corner was torn, and it had been crumpled slightly. The letters were jagged, almost unrecognizable, and the ink, no, the red stain, was unmistakably blood. It read, "I'm sorry, Grace, I love you." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The world seemed to tilt as I backed inside, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking as I dialed the cops, but I already knew this was far from over. Now, as I write this in May of 2015, nothing has come up, no sign of him, no answers. I don't know where that monster is, but I know one thing for sure. Until they find him, dead or alive, I don't think I'll ever be able to sleep without that lingering feeling, the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting. What you do to them in the dream happens to them in real life, with one exception: it doesn't leave any marks on the outside. That's how I got away with it for so long. So Harry said, when the police gave him control, I'm getting ahead of myself again. The curse, we need to talk about how it travels. You know how that curse travels? Through love. You can only pass it along to someone you're in love with. Nice, corrupted little twist on the only thing in existence that actually matters. So I used to love poetry in high school. I lapped up poetry like it was a pool and I was dying of thirst. I swear, there was a poem that reminded me of this curse. I thought the poem went like this. All men curse the things they love. The scent survives their clothes, but the rose's scent is bitterness. To him that loved the rose. But that's not how it goes, which makes sense, because let's be honest, what I just recited doesn't make any sense at all. It's not even that I got it wrong. I somehow combined two poems. I transposed a misremembered Oscar Wilde line. That line actually goes, each man kills the thing he loves, onto a Francis Thompson poem. Francis Thompson's poem actually goes like this. F. You were the fairest things have fleetest end. Their scent survives their clothes, but the rose's scent is bitterness. To him that loved the rose. Anyway, real or not, misremembered or not, my butchered poem about men cursing the things they love reminded me of Jesse. When this started, Jesse and I worked at a residential home. I already told you that. Our clients' stories aren't mine, so I'm not going to share them. That's something you should try to learn. But I will say that most of my clients had suffered serious trauma. Many of them had a predator in their pasts, and sometimes in their present. They started using that dream channel to murder the people who had hurt my clients. There's no point mincing words. I was a serial killer. When Jesse finally found out, he was devastated. He wasn't angry with me. Jesse is gentle that way. He blamed himself for it. He still does. That still makes me hurt. Helmich to Helmich, Barenza countered. That's when he told me everything. He'd had this curse his whole life, yet he never killed anyone. Not because he wasn't tempted. Jesse is a much better person than me, far more concerned with justice and duty and care than I've ever been. Of course he was tempted. But he never killed anyone because this was a hereditary curse, and as a result, he had seen the consequences of falling into the curse with his own eyes. His exact words were, once you start, you can't stop. And if you try to stop after you start, something comes for you. Its name is Karakor. You never want to meet Karakor. It's better to die than let him take you. I believe Jesse. The problem was, I'd already started. For his sake, I'd tried to stop. But once you start, you can't stop. Again, it would take hours to tell you everything that happened, and I am so fucking tired. But long story short, I ended up nearly dead. Jesse saved me by sacrificing himself. I watched him die. 2 days later, he came back. Everything was wonderful for a day or so. We thought the curse was broken, that we were both free and could live normally. About 3 days after he came back, I noticed that Jesse hadn't slept at all. Soon, we both realized he couldn't sleep at all. When you can't sleep, when you can't even have micro naps, you start to fall apart really fast. Jesse started to fall apart. He fell apart to the point where he started to die again. It was because of Karakor. Jesse is the only person I love. I was desperate. I'll spare you the long story and give you the shortest version possible. I found Karakor. My plan was to trade myself for Jesse. I had no idea how it would work, but I assumed it would suit. A life for a life, right? But it didn't go according to plan. In fact, nothing I expected happened. What actually happened was insane. Karakor pulled out one of my eyes and ate it. Then he pulled out one of his eyes. It looked like a star, just like the North Star, and put that star inside my eye socket. Then he lumbered away into the darkness without so much as a word. The last thing I saw were his horns, great twin shadows staining the night sky. I went home, defeated. Only when I got there, Jesse was asleep. Even though I'd lost an eye, I was okay with that. Age discrimination. What I wasn't okay with were his eyes. Jesse had the most beautiful dark eyes, the kind of eyes you can drown in. When I returned from my meeting with Karachaw, one of his eyes was still dark and beautiful as ever, but the other was bright and gold as a polished coin. I thought that was the end. Only nothing is ever the end. Not for us. Within a week, Jesse had stopped sleeping. A couple of days after that, he was falling apart again, dying from lack of sleep. One of my least favorite things about life is you are always engaged in negotiations. Even if you don't know what you're negotiating for, even if you don't understand the negotiations, even if you don't realize you're negotiating, you are every minute of every day. And when Karachaw took my eye and gave me his and made it so Jesse could sleep again, he wasn't giving me a gift. He was negotiating. By exchanging his eye for mine, I'd agreed to negotiations. My side of the bargain I had no idea I'd struck was to continue murdering people in their dreams in exchange for Jesse's continued health. By the time I finally figured that out, Jesse was almost dead, but he was still awake and aware enough to cry when I slipped into my cursed death sleep. I was crouched over him when I felt air strike my skin and lifted me off my feet. I distinctly remember his soul saying, "Be gone." When I surfaced after committing yet another murder, he was still crying, but otherwise he was healthy. More importantly, he slept that night. Karachaw came to me in dreams after that. Every time he appeared in my dreams, he gave me a target, showed me visions that gave me everything I needed to locate and kill my victim. This was a problem for me. You see, Karachaw was not as discerning as I was. I'm a bloodthirsty killer, I'll admit it, a vigilante from hell, but even I have limits. I limit my killing sprees to predators. Karachaw did not respect those limits, not at all. So I reopened negotiations. The results were I got to pick who I killed, but Jesse had to join me. You have to understand that Karachaw has always wanted Jesse. At great cost to himself, Jesse denied Karachaw his entire life. I undid his denial, took away his agency, his consent. But I didn't do it because I wanted to. I did it out of love. That's not an excuse, it's not a defense, it's just a fact. I did it because I love Jesse. I did it for Jesse. Jesse will do and has done everything for me. He's done things I asked for and things I haven't, all for love. He never resented any of it. But he resented this. He resents it so much that I think he wishes he never loved me. But I had no choice. It was do or die. That's the curse. See something, do something. And now both our lives depended on Jesse doing something. It was something he had refused to do his whole life up until that point. But refusal was no longer an option. If he refused, we both died. He knew it. Even if he stopped loving me, even if he hated me, I don't think Jesse would ever want me to die. So he became a dream killer too. Not because he wanted to, but just because he loved me. I got a job booking inmates into a big regional jail, ironic, I know, and that made it very easy to find targets. Once I was on top of that, the records for past offenders were perfectly accessible. And after that, specifically after seeing the abuses perpetuated on inmates who deserved it, and many more who didn't, it was only a matter of time before Jesse and I started going after the guards. By that time, I could fully control my dreams and direct the creation of the dream channels. I could travel. I could bring Jesse with me. I could see things, secrets and hidden actions and forgotten memories that no one without my abilities would ever see. I uncovered terrible things that have been buried and concealed. I saw things that have never seen the light, unless you count the light of my starry eye. That's what my eye looks like in the death dreams, a bright and blinding star that sees all and burns what it finds wanting. Yes, he couldn't handle it. He tried so hard, but he simply could not cope. We're talking breakdowns, anxiety attacks, outbursts, mania, psychosis. Anything and everything you could think of went wrong with him. And it was my fault, all my fault, because I was traumatizing him, not because I wanted to, because traumatizing him was the only way to keep him alive. I guess it's not surprising that he eventually refused to sleep. After a particularly and admittedly unnecessarily brutal murder that I take full responsibility for, he promised to never sleep again. To that end, he tried to take his life. I stopped him, but he was in the hospital for days. Meanwhile, Karachor still had his errands for me to run. I was fully capable of running them alone, but that wasn't enough. A solo effort, after all, wasn't our deal. Finally, Karachor came to me in a dream and said if Jesse and I didn't start working together again, and soon, he would start assigning targets again. And I already told you Karachor's targets tend to violate my own boundaries. Second floor. When Jesse finally got out of the hospital, he didn't try to kill himself again, thank God. But he still wanted to sleep as little as possible. I didn't support him in this. I mean, how could I? One night, he begged me to just let everything go, to end ourselves together and move on to whatever comes after. Even if nothing comes after, he said, at least we'll be free. But I couldn't do that. I couldn't lose Jesse. I still told him that. So in order to keep himself from sleeping, and in doing so, prevent me from utilizing him in my death dreams, he intentionally developed a raging meth addiction. Because he wasn't sleeping, Karachor got to call the shots. He was assigning death errands to me nightly, making me see all kinds of things. If you see something, do something, right? If you see something without doing something, you die. Only I wasn't allowed to do anything without Jesse. But no matter what Karachor showed me, and no matter what I said or did to Jesse, he still wouldn't sleep for more than a few minutes at a time. I was desperate. I couldn't lose Jesse. I can't lose him. Though I got heroin during one of his 5-minute crash naps, I dosed him up. And that was that. I know that's not really like sleeping, but it was close enough. I kept him under for a long time. Long enough to catch up on Karachor's list of death errands. By the end of it, Jesse was in full-blown addiction. I didn't even have to give it to him. He started taking it himself. He was under so often that I went absolutely wild. I have literally lost count of the number of people I've killed. Jesse and I are both addicts, you know. I need to kill these people. I need to know they're never going to hurt anyone again. I need to know their last moments are every bit as humiliating and agonizing as what they inflicted on the people they hurt. He paused. Every time I think about it, I smile. Jesse was devastated when he passed his curse on to me, but he shouldn't have been. It was the best of both worlds. He freed himself and passed his burden along to someone who thinks it's an extraordinary gift. Everything he did was literally done out of love, and it showed. The only mistakes made were mine. I made a mistake when I tried to stop after starting and brought Karachor down on Jesse. Made a profound mistake when I dragged Jesse back into this. When I recast the curse, he finally broke for himself. Now he'll never be free, and it's all because of me. I've tried to reopen negotiations with Karachor a dozen times, to no avail. It doesn't work that way. Once you start, you can't stop. And I made Jesse start. You should let him go. He's not the murderer, he's the opposite. If you get him clean and stick him back on in the real world, he'll be fine. He just needs to be away from me. He's a man, and a good one, a wonderful one, not a monster. Me, on the other hand, as one woman she did. The troll bellowed. Oh, Morphinus, guardian of the bridge, nemesis of banality, demiurge of lies, and collector king of titles. Now may I pass? Past what? To whom, child? There is not another soul here. May I cross the bridge? You may cross it out of existence, but then you'll never get to the other side. As a practical alternative, I suggest you die. Seima felt a strange tingling in her brain. What do you suggest I die? She asked. Surely you must mean, which you? It was as if a second voice had been born within her first, a narrative voice. I've yet to meet a sheepish witch, she said. Child, you would butcher the spelling rather than the spellcaster. How rude. I have rued nothing in my life. If you've an eye, you should see that soon you won't be true, as I've 2 eyes, and next I will be 3. A sea cannot be crossed without a ship. Why then not put down roots instead? I already have a root, said Seema. It leads. With that, Homophonus bowed and stepped aside, pointing with his staff to the other side of the bridge. Godspeed, child. Where have these voices come from? Seema wondered as she crossed. They did not sound like hers. They were foreign yet familiar. It wasn't until she had left the bridge far behind that she remembered. The voices belonged to all the storytellers she had ever known, were of all the stories she had ever heard, and she was glad for their company as her own story sprouted in her mind, granting her more and more weight against the raging winds. She understood that her success demanded not only a rousing tale, but equally an effective voice to tell it, and now she had an entire cultural history from which to choose. Having overcome the naked bird of self-doubt, the welcome bench of dejection and the tree of fruitful misery, the punishing wind of frivolity and the staff troll of clever wordplay, Seema arrived at the god statue's shoulder. Many had not made it even this far. Then again, many great storytellers had, Ubalut Sadbard among them, but still failed to make the god statue cry. Footnote. Seema pressed on. The god statue's shoulders were appropriately wide and included a winding footpath leading to a towering god neck. The god neck had a ladder. As she started to climb, a voice boomed. Please get off my neck. The ladder is for technical personnel only. It's off limits for humans. There should be a sign. There used to be a sign. Seema slid down the ladder and neared the god collarbone. Hello, she said. Far above, something moved. Big stone lips and 2 nostrils appeared in the sky. The nostrils, Seema saw, were the source of the strong winds she had encountered during her ascent. Speak if you must, the booming voice said. I am Seema of Nosanin, and I am here to tell a sad story. I am the Godhead, summit of the god statue, said the Godhead. I will listen. But tell me, Seema, is your story truly miserable? I believe it is. Is it more miserable than the story told by the last storyteller who came this way? I'm not sure, Mr. Godhead. I don't know that story, but I can assure you that the one I'll tell is the most horrible, miserable, and woeful one I've ever heard. He ends with a sad, You're young for a human, aren't you? Asked the Godhead. I am, said Seema. In my divine experience, young humans are not nearly as miserably minded as old ones. In my defense, I am an orphan, Mr. Godhead. Anyway, proceed. Once upon a time, in a land far below, parentless and alone, in a great dust bowl of a world, there lived a girl. If I may interrupt, the Godhead said, I have a question. Is this the first story you have ever told? Yes, Mr. Godhead. He began. If I may interrupt once more to ask a follow-up question. Is your story about you? This caught Seema off guard, and for a second she panicked, wondering whether she had misunderstood the nature of her inner voice, her narrative voice, and if that voice was not in fact the voice of the Godhead which had infiltrated her mind. It is, she said. How did you know? I may answer that in 2 ways. First, I am the Godhead, so I can know all. Second, I have listened to an eternity of stories, and that experience has allowed me to formulate several critical opinions, one of which is that first-time storytellers often tell stories about themselves. These stories are boring and terrible, and no one should listen to them. They are miserable, said the Godhead, in all the wrong ways. I tell these stories of victory and survival. Seema did not know how to respond. The fate of her people depended on her, but she had indeed decided to tell a tale about herself. Should I continue, Mr. Godhead? If you must. I feel I must continue, she said, refocusing and taking a deep breath. As I was saying, once upon a time, in a land far below. Oh, he said, still trying to speak, but lacking the words to express his meaning. That you have established yourself here. The Godhead, said the Godhead. For my own records, if nothing else. What, human child, did you say your name was? Seema. Your full name? Sama of Nosanim. The godhead paused, emitting no sound and ceasing its breathwind, before two orbal eyes emerged in the sky above its godly lips and celestial nostrils. They squinted. They blinked. "And you say you are an orphan?" "I am, Mr. Godhead." "An orphan of Nosadime?" Yes. There began now a tremendously deep rumbling. "Orphan Sama of Nosadime." The rumbling deepened. It felt like all of existence had begun to vibrate. "Sama of Nosadime, Nosadime, an Orsaname," an orphan echoed back in the dark. "Oh, that's good. That is very good." Sama stood motionless, staring up at the face in the sky. His eyes had closed, its lips had curved into a smile, and the rumble had become a chuckle, a divine, omniscient giggling to a guffaw, become an all-out boisterous laugh, which was awful and infectious, and Sama too joined in the laughter, until from one of the godhead's eyes there escaped a solitary tear. Sama watched in wonder as it flowed toward the corner of the eye, and fell. "I've done it," she thought. And not only that, the first teardrop was only the beginning. Soon tear after tear was flowing from the godhead's eye, and raining on the world below, her people's world, the parched world from where even the drought bunnies had sought escape. If only she could have seen the expressions on their faces. It is difficult to say for how long they laughed together, the girl and the godhead, but I'm sure it was a long time. And after the laughter had passed, the godhead said, "Sama, it has been an eon since I have heard a joke. I must say it has been a pleasure to experience one again, and I thank you for delivering to me such a precious gift." "You are welcome, Mr. Godhead," said Sama. "Go now, but promise you shall visit again someday with another joke to share." Sama promised. Smiling, she turned, walked the winding footpath to the god shoulder, and happily began her descent down the god statue. She passed the troll bridge, the place of the winds, Ubalut Sadbard sitting darkly on his bench, and the spot where the featherless bird had exploded, which had retained the faint smell of blood. It wasn't until she was several hundred steps below, however, that a horrible tremor passed through her, because, rather than diminishing, the smell of blood had intensified. She paused for a moment, sniffed the air and listened. She was not far from the ground, and certain sounds wafted gently into her ears. Screams, mumbled pleas, the breaking of bones, the snapping of things human and sinewy. And she sped up, leaping rather than walking, steps at a time. When she reached the surface of the world, she noticed at once that it was different than she remembered. Where the land had been dry and barren, it was now verdant and overgrown. Where it had been dusty, it was damp. Grasses had grown taller than she. Trees had gnarled into foreboding serpentine shapes. And the stench of blood was undeniable. Even before reaching the entrance to her village, she splashed through puddles of it, marking her legs with crimson, and the sounds only grew louder, in voices more familiar. She called out all the names she knew. She called out for anyone, but nobody answered. There was only the breaking and the snapping, the crunching and the chewing, her breathing, and the bunny stepped into her pup. She slid it into a tumbled hole. It was 100 feet tall and porous, a biological framework of bone interwoven with strings of pale flesh and wet vines, sprouting varicolored flowers and tufts of white fur. And in its belly, which writhed like worms, she saw the remains of Popsmall Rencod. The bunny perceived her with its charcoal eyes. From within it, the half-digested remains of Popsmall Rencod gurgled like bubbles rising through a swamp of vomit. The bunny bared its teeth. Sama ran past the bunny, toward the village, where with racing heart she witnessed absolute devastation. Buildings lay as rubble. Bodies littered the once peaceful streets. The surrounding fields, fertile with agitated vegetation, snarled and cursed, and silhouetted against the red and thundering sky loomed the bunnies. "Sama, The syllables of her own name startled her. "Sema," said the skinless face of a man, pulling himself toward her. He had been halved. His legs were nowhere to be seen. "Sema, run!" the man said, and as he neared her, she recognized him as the chief. "A terrible has happened. The worst," the London said suggestively. "I don't understand," said Sema, crouching, involved in research into the meaning of these current psychics. "Exercising belief. I made the god statue cry. I ascended to the summit and I made him laugh, and it was you?" The chief's upper body lunged. He grabbed her leg, bit her ankle. She kicked him off and backed away. "What's happened?" "Tears of mirth and not tears of sorrow. I thought," Sema said, "you have damned us all." At those words, the chief's upper body expired, and Sema collapsed in dreadful comprehension to the saturated ground, on which violently sprouting blades of grass cut at her skin, releasing her tragic essence into the soil, concluded Ubalut Saabad, while peeking up at the godhead's features, trying to gauge its reaction, exclaimed, going to the point of screaming, "It's the nasty!" There was no. He prayed that he hadn't bored the godhead to death. "Godhead," he called out. "Nothing. Releasing her tragic essence into the soil," he repeated, with a little more oomph at the end. Godhead stared. Yes. I mean, are you finished?" "It's quite all right if you're finished, you know. Are you all on the edge of tears?" "Well, to be truthful, I may have dozed off somewhere in the middle, but I did catch the beginning, and now you've also given me the end. Her tragic essence oozed out into the mud and so forth, so the second act is easily implied. And it's no Climbenemy by Harpscordian, but that perhaps is too high a bar." "I see," said Ubalut Sadbad. The obstacles were overcome a little easily, wouldn't you say? They were a smidgen too symbolic as well, but as a symbol myself, I may be oversensitive. The girl lacked a certain cohesion of character. Another draft may have been in order before you came all the way up here. I mean, I don't see how a girl could have bettered an experienced and titled troll in a contest of verbal wit, no matter how much culture she would have consumed in her short life, not to mention that the troll himself is, as one woman who described herself as experiencing the second collision, I think we can agree, a lazy trope. Also, in the end there, you really let yourself go in the telling. There's style, and then there's that. I felt as if the tragedy were being pushed onto me, as if you were pushing the tragedy onto me. You, excuse me, you used the passive voice. It would have been better in the active voice. Are you critiquing my critique? My sincere apologies. Sometimes my inner editor comes out when I'm interacting with others. That's a laugh and a half, because based on your story, I wouldn't have imagined you have much of an inner editor. Funny. It was, wasn't it? Yeah, just don't cry. I might be able to deal with my friends and family starving to death, but I wouldn't be able to deal with their being mauled by rabbits, bunnies, whatever they are. You know, that's not actually what happens. When I laugh, I mean. Yeah, it's what our legends say. Tears of mirth lead to complete annihilation by unbound planetary fertility and mutated drought bunnies. No, that part is surprisingly accurate. Pat on the back for that. What I meant is that laughing doesn't make me cry. Oh, where do you get tears of mirth? Oh dear me, that is a real inconsistency, isn't it? Fan amount of luck it does me. Yes, don't worry too much about it. It doesn't really matter, and I could always say I cry at weddings, couldn't I? You're asking me. I'm being polite. I'm the godhead. I can do and say whatever I like. Are there other godheads? No, just me. That woman asked me. Are you married? To what? A human? A rocking chair? A mountain chain? Chainside? Oh, at whose wedding would you cry? I see you're still poking at this. Not yours. All your potential human mates are about to starve to death in an arid world of dust and desolation, replied Clive, with a snort that sent the puffs of smoke back into the man's nose. The godhead chuckled. "That's not funny," said Ubalut Sardbard. "It's even rather sad if you think about it." "Fuck," thought Ubalut Sadbard, raising his face from his hands. "That's what I should have fucking said. I went too personal with the innocent and the girl when I should have gone cosmic with the death of humanity. That's the real tragedy. Now I'm stuck here on this cold, uncomfortable metal bench, eating that stupid black fruit, which doesn't even taste that good, while my world turned to dust and I'll never see anyone again. I'm such a stupid fucking failure." A featherless bird landed on the stupid black fruit tree. "At least you're still alive," it squawked. Again, "I thought I had gotten rid of you." "You did, but I got reborn." "Good for you." "I always get reborn. It comes with the territory. I wouldn't be much of an obstacle otherwise. The first storyteller to make the climb would make me go poof, and that'd be that." Has anyone ever turned back just because you told them to? Pen. Once. A few minutes ago. Some little girl came up and I started squawking at her, you know the shtick. Well, she got really sad and started to cry, then turned around and ran back down the stairs. Seema, speak to me in bird-level words. The girl, was her name Seema, of no surname? How would I know? Ubalut Sarbud leapt suddenly off the bench, to his aching feet. The bird squawked, going somewhere? But he was already running down the staircase, chasing after the girl. Maybe he didn't have the storytelling chops to save the world. Maybe he wasn't a literary giant. "Seema!" he yelled. "Seema, stop!" But there was no reason why Seema of Nossaname, a character he fucking created, should have to suffer twice, first in his lousy story, and now again in the real world. "Seema, for the love of Godhead, don't go down there." "Don't worry." Ubalute Sadbad didn't subsequently trip over his own feet, although I argue that he could have, because I did hint at the possibility, with the aching bit, break his neck and fail to save his character, who, despite lacking consistency, did later become a beloved creation of his. Ubalute Zeta has seminal roles and is the most believable because evidence of her activism on climate change has supported by lifetime activism. Now, what happened was this. He raced down the stairs at a much greater speed than Seema, probably on account of his longer adult legs and renewed sense of purpose, met her on the penultimate step, and saved her life, discovering in the process the something inside of himself which makes every human special and every human life invaluable. That inextinguishable spark of divine potential that not even a godhead in his damnation can extinguish. A spark so powerful it made Ubalut Sadbard the first person to ever slump onto the bench of dejection, note the proper capitalization, and rise from it. He quivered. The godhead's mouth quivered. "That's what I do, I had him. The setup, the middle, the twist ending, plus the coup de grace. The mighty. Damn you, harpsichordian," the godhead said, its tears beginning slowly to trickle. "You get me every time. Every single time I think, no, he won't do it. He can't. I've already heard Cleonomini, and nothing can top the betrayal scene in that. Yet here we are. You've outdone yourself once again, and I just can't handle it, you know. Your stories, the way you tell them, At this point, the Godhead's speech became a sob-logged babble that I couldn't understand, but that's not important. What's important is that I descended the God statue in a triumphantly woeful rain that replenished the soil, saved the world, and earned me another round of accolades. Deserved accolades, I might add, because you have to acknowledge your own worth. If you're great, and pretending otherwise is mere ostentation. Unfortunately, there was one small hiccup. It turns out that while tears of mirth are unlike tears of sorrow, the interpretation of legends is not an exact science, and you shouldn't take everything literally. So while the Godhead's tears did replenish the soil and save the world, you really shouldn't get any kind of tears on a drought bunny unless you wanted to morph into a hideous man-eating monster. The way I see it though, the blame isn't totally my own. The bunnies fucked up by losing their faith in me and coming out of their holes when they totally should not have done that. I maybe fucked up by waiting too long to compose this story and make my way up the god statue. If I'd done it earlier, the bunnies would have been underground, we would have survived, and you would have gotten a happier ending. This book is for the bunnies. It's time to fly. Say life, right? Oh, and please excuse the absurd length of this final paragraph and any spelling mistakes. It's dark here in the drought bunny's belly, its stomach juices are melting my organs, and I'm writing through sincerely agonizing pain. But as a wise man once said, we write to the bitter end. Dying now, farewell. It was me. I said the bitter end thing in Deep breath and goodbye for real.